Hi, my name is Amy. I'm a UX designer and an artist, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about how artists can use tools and principles from UX design in their work. Often when we think about art, it's all about what the artist was trying to say. Art can be a way for an artist to express themselves, and art is often very emotional and very raw. And an artist might only consider the viewer in terms of how the viewer is going to receive or understand whatever it is that they're trying to communicate, or they might not even think about the viewer at all. And that's totally valid, but a lot of art nowadays is experiential, and that implies that there is a person having that experience. And a lot of art is also interactive, and that implies that the audience is not just a viewer but a participant, and they are involved in the interaction and they are using the artwork, and therefore we can call them a user. I think a lot of people, even in the UX field, do hate calling people users, but for whatever reason it is the accepted term, and you will hear me use it because it is just so commonly used. So it might seem kind of corporate or cold to talk about UX for your art installation, but really it's just that you're trying to create an experience for your audience, and there is this whole field of UX, and it is geared towards considering people's experience. So why not look to that field and see what tools and methodologies we can take from it as artists. A lot of artists these days are using interaction, but if you don't consider the user in that interaction, then you get stuff like this happening, kind of warning people to be careful of an interaction and telling them even not to use the interactivity if they're not confident to do so. If you went to Google and it said, if you're not 100% sure that you're going to type your search correctly, then just don't search here at all. That would not be a great experience. Why are we doing that in artworks? There were artists in this exhibition who had created something interactive, but they hadn't actually considered what it was going to be like for members of the public to use it. And I think by looking to UX, we can find ways to do this better. UX stands for user experience, and user experience design is about putting the user at the center of everything that we do. If you look around whatever space you're in now, probably pretty much everything around you was designed in some way, unless you're like sitting in a field. Obviously that applies to computers, but it also applies to stuff like washing machines and microwaves, which are well known for having non-user friendly interfaces. But it also applies even to things like doors. We've all walked up to a door and pushed when we should have pulled, and it always makes you feel stupid, but actually it's the fault of the designer, because if they didn't make it clear, then that's bad UX. And it is the job of the designer to consider how their creation will actually be used by somebody and make sure that it is usable. And UX design as a professional field can be thought of as a process or a set of tools. I'm going to talk you through some of these tools: research, sketching, flows, prototypes, testing, and iteration. So there's loads to mention. By the end of this video you should have a good overview, as well as like some really specific tips, and also you should have a good idea of what to Google if you want to know more, which I think is often a large part of the battle. Sometimes it helps to define a research question, and it could be something like, what makes art memorable, or how can I make art that makes people feel empowered, or how can I make art that makes people feel connected to one another. Your research question should not be some form of, what do people think of my idea? That would be testing and not research. Testing your idea at this stage is not necessarily going to be useful. If you tell people your idea and ask them what they think, the people that don't like it, you're not necessarily going to find out anything useful about why they don't like it or what could be better. And the people that do like it, you're just going to take that as a glowing endorsement that you're an artistic genius. So this is more about an exploration, trying to find out what people think about various things, trying to find out experiences that they've had in the past, behaviors that they have, feelings that they have, and not their opinion on your fantastic idea. So coming up with a discussion guide, sometimes we call it a script, but it's certainly not something that you should stick to exactly. It should be something to help the conversation flow, and it makes sure that you get the right things out of the discussion. I like to bold some questions so that I can make sure that I get answers to those things, because if the conversation does start flowing, you might forget that there was something that you really wanted to know. When it comes to actually designing the questions that you're going to ask people, you want to stick to open-ended questions as much as possible, so not yes or no questions, and you'll need some yes or no questions as well to get your conversation going and just find information out. But yeah, try and include as many open-ended questions and get people talking as much as possible. It's also really helpful to ask about specific incidences. So instead of saying what makes you feel connected to people, you could ask, what's the last time that you really felt connected to somebody? Or what's the time that you felt most connected to somebody in your life? And then investigate more about that specific situation, and you'll usually get a lot more out of it. During the session, it's really good to refer back to things that people have said. It lets people know that you're listening, and also it gives you a chance to find out more information. If someone uses kind of a specific word, it's often a really good trick just to ask them what they mean by that word. So if they say, for example, yeah, I was really disappointed by that, you could say, what do you mean by disappointed? Obviously you know what the word disappointed means, but by honing in on it and asking them to expand on it, you'll find that they explain things in a different way. You might get a different perspective on what they're saying, and it could be a really interesting way to delve into what the person is telling you. Also, silence can be a really great tool. People want to fill a silence. It feels awkward. You will want to fill it, but if you can hold off and allow the person that you're interviewing to fill it, then you never know what they're going to say, and it might be something really insightful and interesting. Also, don't forget to frequently remind them that what they're telling you is interesting and useful, and that they're helping you. You might be thinking in your head like, wow, this is so interesting, this is great, but you need to say that out loud to people and let them know that what they're telling you is useful and that you're really interested to hear it. Not only is it nice and helpful to that person, but it also will encourage them to talk to you more. At the start of the session, it's useful to give a little overview of what's going to happen, let them know how long it's going to take. If you're recording, then let them know exactly what recording is happening and what you're going to do with it. Like if there's a chance that video or audio could end up in a final piece that you're making, definitely let people know that and check that they're okay with it. Also let them know that they can refuse to answer any questions at any point, and also let them know that they can stop the session at any time if they'd like to. I think even just telling people that they have that option helps them feel comfortable. And if it is something with a more sensitive topic, then you might want to consider having them sign a consent form as well. Ideally, when you're running a research session, you shouldn't be taking notes. If you have two people, then one of you can take notes and one of you can run the session. That's a really good way to do it. But if there's just you as the artist, then you should be recording and then take your notes later, because taking notes while a person is talking is really going to take you out of the conversation and you won't be able to connect with them in the same way. I find the best way to kind of draw out learnings or insights from research sessions is to go through all of the sessions and make notes on post-its. And then you can do a process that we call affinity mapping. So this is where we draw together similar points that were made by different people into categories. A category could be, this is all examples of things that made people feel disconnected. Or it could be, this is all stuff about physical distance and how it affected how connected people feel. Then once you have everything in categories, and then you can list out those key insights, keep them maybe somewhere posted up that you'll see them often so that you can bear them in mind and use them to inform your designs as you go through the design process. So design is something that obviously most artists are doing already, but there are a couple of things that I wanted to point out. The first one is sketching. In UX, there is a real push to sketch on paper before kind of using any digital tools. One of the key things to remember about sketching is that unless you're drawing something for a client or for a grant team or something like that, then the sketch is about communicating and developing your ideas, and it's not about being visually impressive. Focus your sketching on communication rather than looking nice. And sketching can be a great way to work through ideas and figure things out. When you're drawing on paper to develop an idea, the idea and the thinking is happening between your brain and the paper. And also when you are collaborating with another person, sketching out ideas can be a good way to communicate your ideas between one another and make sure that you're both on the same page about what it is that you're talking about. So a lot of artists are probably sketching already, but what you might not be doing is designing flows. So you'll be familiar with flowcharts in some format, I'm sure. In UX, we use flows to map out how a user moves through an experience. You can also use them for more technical flows, thinking about how a program works, but it can also be used to look at the emotional journey that a person goes through in your installation. And we would call this an experience map. So where we map out somebody's experience and their thoughts and feelings that they're happening as they move through your work. So if you have a current installation, you could map out the experience that people are having, and it can be a way to kind of bring to the surface where there are problems and kind of visualize them. For example, if currently people show up and they're confused at the start, then creating that experience map and thinking about what they're thinking at that point is a good way to map out the problems. And then you could create another experience map that is the experience that you want people to have, and think about how you can move from one experience to the other. Prototyping is a huge part of the UX process. So a prototype is basically when you have part of the project or the project is unfinished, and it's usually to test some specific thing or several things. You might hear people talk about fidelity of a prototype, and that is kind of a measure of how detailed it is or how close it is to the intended finished product. A prototype could be to test a specific technical thing, like does this piece of code work? Am I able to get this thing to cause this to happen? Or it could be to test the overall tech of your whole project, but not looking at the aesthetics at all. Or it could be to test the interface without any of the tech actually working, so you could create your interface without anything behind it and see whether people know where to click. So once you have a prototype, you should test it with real people. It sounds obvious, but a lot of artists aren't doing this. I mean, a lot of people aren't doing this in general. Like, it often doesn't happen in web design as well, and it's a real shame because, for example, if you're creating an artwork and then the first time people use it is the first day that it's installed in a gallery or a festival or whatever, and then you realize that the people aren't understanding things the way that you thought they would, then it might be too late to make changes. And one of the best ways to test something is just to observe people using it. It sounds simple, and it really is, but it just often doesn't happen. So you might want to come up with a few kind of scenarios to test with. You might want to say to people, can you try and make this specific thing happen? And that's definitely a good thing to do, but also you can just literally watch people using what it is that you've made and try not to guide them too much. Sometimes it can be really tempting if you're watching a person struggle to just help them. Try to hold back and try and just watch what people are doing. So you're trying to see if they understand what your buttons are for, you're trying to see if they notice that if they wave their arm something will happen. Then you can kind of ask gentle questions like, what do you think is going to happen if you do that, or did what you expected happen, or how did that make you feel? But yeah, try not to tell people click here, wave your arm, stuff like that, because you won't always be there to do that. I will sometimes develop a little idea and then take it round to some friends. That's kind of a good low pressure way to get some feedback and do a technical test on something. I do also use observation in live installations. So for example, in the Space Tunnel, when I have taken that to festivals, I will often just go into the Space Tunnel. It kind of sounds a bit creepy maybe, but I just go in and not let anyone know that I made it, and I'll just listen to the conversations that are going on, stand by the control panel and watch people use it and see where they're having problems and what they're saying to their friends or other people around them, then that is useful to me for future installations. I've also posted surveys after installations. So for one thing, this is a great way to gather compliments, which are useful for like pull quotes for putting on your website and stuff like that. But it's also a really great way to get feedback, including suggestions of future versions, which, you know, sometimes are useful and sometimes not so much. But yeah, it's a good way to find out what worked for people and what didn't, and where they had problems that you might not have noticed, and what they think that you should do in the future. Whenever a project involves technology, it can also be useful to collect numeric data. So this is something that is particularly easy to get in web-based projects because you can use Google Analytics. But really any project that's using code, if you wanted to, you could create some kind of analytics to look at how people are using it. So in Google Analytics, the simplest things are you can look at page views, visitor numbers, how much traffic you're getting, stuff like that. But you can also tag events with a Google Analytics tag, which will fire off whenever a certain function happens. For example, in my spirograph, people were hitting the speed up button more than anything else. And it, like, if there's one thing I've learned about human behavior from making interactive art, is that people love to mash a speed up button, because it used to happen in the Space Tunnel as well. I would see people see that speed up button and immediately be like, faster, faster, faster. But also it made me think, if people are pressing that button hundreds of times, then maybe I need to make it speed up in bigger increments. So that was something that I learned from the analytics, and I made it so that it goes up in fives, I think, rather than just steps of one, so people don't have to click that button quite so. So once you have found learnings from your testing and observation and analytics and so on, then you should incorporate them into the next version of your design. So whether it's a prototype that hasn't gone live yet and you're developing your next prototype, moving towards the final product, or whether it's a final product and you're taking learnings for the next time, we call this process of testing and building iteration. So just like in code where you can iterate through a loop, do something a number of times, we iterate between creation and learning. And so the UX design process becomes a loop going between learning, which consists of research and testing, and creation, which consists of design, prototyping and build. So I really hope this has been useful for you. It's been really fun to kind of even go into detail on this in ways that I hadn't thought about before. For example, the research thing, like that's something that I do a lot in my work as a UX designer, but I haven't ever really done it in any detail for a art project, and I'm really excited to do that now that I've thought through that process more in the context of artwork. So I hope it's useful for you as well. Make sure you subscribe to my channel. I post all kinds of videos, works in progress, behind the scenes stuff, tutorials, and I think you'll like it, so subscribe.